Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Bat Chat. My name is Olivia Hopkins, and I'm a cadet with Girl Scouts USA. I'm thrilled to partner with Bat Conservation International and to raise awareness regarding these winged wonders. Worldwide, bat populations are declining at an alarming rate. Climate change, wind turbines, and vanishing habitats have all contributed to significant loss. In North America, white nose syndrome has killed millions of hibernating bats in the United States and Canada. Many of the more than 1,400 species of bats globally are considered threatened or nearing extinction. It is vital that we help restore balance and assist these amazing animals. Without them, our environment will be irreversibly harmed. Bats play an essential role in our ecosystem by helping to disperse seeds, support cave biomes, and assist in pollination during the evening while the rest of the world sleeps. More importantly, bats are bioindicators of an ecosystem's overall health, which is why the study of these highly intelligent animals is critical. As the scope and severity of threats increase, so does the need for collaborative research, monitoring, and public support for bat conservation. As a Girl Scout, I make a promise to make the world a better place and to respect our natural resources. That is why today's Bat Chat is important in helping to dispel myths and educate communities across the world as to the importance of bats and why they need our support now more than ever. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kristen Lear, the Agave Restoration Program Director with Bat Conservation International. Her field research has been instrumental in helping to navigate and interpret key indicators regarding global passion and life's work have been featured in numerous academic journals and highlighted in National Geographic Explorer. She serves as an ambassador for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Her work is making an impact in the field with bats. Appreciation to Dr. Kristen Lear, BCI's Development Coordinator, Linda Basor, and to everyone joining us this afternoon. Together, we can make a profound difference in conservation efforts and help restore bat populations. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Olivia. I hear that your teacher and fellow students from Mr. Barrett's Pleasant Plains Green Team are watching today, so welcome. So after the presentation, Kristen will have time to answer your questions, which you can type in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom, or you can type into the comments if you're watching on another platform. Olivia also collected questions for us ahead of time from her classmates, Girl Scout troop, and other groups and schools that they're partnered with. Okay, now that all of that's out of the way, you can take it away, Kristen.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to see you all here. It looks like we have over 140 people logged in to watch live. So thank you all for joining. I am very excited to talk today about my favorite animals, bats. Bats are the coolest animal in the world, in my opinion. So I'm here to share all about the amazing world of bats. So let me go ahead and pull up my screen and we will get this going. Linda, can you all see the screen?
Yep, so we can see it.
Okay,
Yep.
Perfect. Well, welcome to the amazing world of bats. I am here to share about all the different kind of cool bat facts, why bats are important, and some of the things that we can do to help bats around the world. So welcome everyone. I wanted to start with a little intro to myself and how I got into the field of bat conservation. This is me here with my dad in 6th grade, so when I was 12 years old, building bat houses for my Girl Scout Silver Award project. This was my first introduction to learning about bats and to figuring out how I could do something to help bats in my own neighborhood. So I built these bat houses from scratch, built 4 bat houses and put them up in a local park in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up. I will say, if you know anything about bat houses, these ones that I had built way back when are not the best designs. We've learned a lot about bat house design since I built these. But this was my first experience getting to actually do something to help bats. Unfortunately, a few weeks after I installed these bat houses in the park, I went back to visit them and check how they were doing, and somebody had come through the park and vandalized my bat houses and tore them down off of the where they were mounted. So you can imagine, 12-year-old me was very, very sad, but I did not let that stop me. I continued learning more about bats even after that project. And then when I was in college, I decided I wanted to study bats, and I found out that you could actually learn about bats. You could work with bats hands-on and do research. So at Ohio Wesleyan University, I studied zoology, or the study of animals, and got my first field research experiences. You can see this little eastern red bat here working in Texas. I got to catch bats for the first time, track them, see where they were roosting and feeding, and it was just the most amazing experience ever. So in college, that's when I decided that I wanted to make bat conservation my career. So after college, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, but before graduate school, I wanted to travel and see more bat species and learn more about different bats. So I got to go to Australia and live in Australia for a year, studying a critically endangered bat species here in Australia. Got to go caving, got to use some really cool technology to study these bats. And that's when I knew that I was on the right path. Then I did my PhD in integrative conservation at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. And this time I switched to working with pollinating bats that eat nectar from these giant agave plants that grow in the Southwest US and Mexico. So I got to do this really cool project, and that led into my current job here at Bat Conservation International. We are a nonprofit that works around the world to end bat extinctions. And so I get to lead our agave restoration initiative, restoring these agave plants that you see here for pollinating bats in the Southwest US and Mexico. So it really landed my dream job, and I'm very happy to answer any questions at the end about how you become a bat scientist, what things you can start doing now to help prepare you. So feel free to think of those questions and ask those later. So what about bats makes them so cool? Well, there's currently over 1,450 species, that number keeps going up, species or types of bats around the world. And you can see here, I love these pictures because you can see the diversity of bats around the world. There's different colors of bats. There's these little white bats that are tent-making bats that make little tents from leaves. We have like this orange, very, very bright orange bat in the bottom left, black and white bats, and you have like big eyes, small eyes, some have big teeth, big ears. Just a huge diversity of bats around the world. And bats make up 20% of all mammal species. So I'll get more into this later, but bats are not rodents. They are their own order of mammals. So they're very special, and they make up 20% of all mammal species. So some cool bat facts. These are some of my favorite bat facts out there. So the world's largest bat is one of the fruit bats, or one of the flying foxes. And the world's largest bat has a wingspan of, any guesses on how big the wingspan is for the largest bat? So wingtip to wingtip. I'll let you come up with your guesses. Feel free to put them in the chat if you have any guesses in the chat. Let's see. I see some good 6 feet, 5 feet, 4.5 feet, 12 feet. Ooh, that's pretty cool. Yeah, y'all are doing pretty good guesses. Okay, you ready? Drum roll. 6 feet. So some of you nailed it. 6 feet. That's pretty big. That is longer than I am tall. So these bats have really, really long wings. Any guesses on how much these big bats weigh? In pounds. I'll tell you in pounds, not kilograms. Anybody in the chat, put your guesses for how much these 6-foot wingspan bats weigh. 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 2 pounds, 650. Yeah, that'd be a big one. 3 pounds. You guys are getting good guesses. Love all these guesses. 2 to 3. 5 pounds. Okay, you ready? Drum roll. I feel like some of you might have heard some bat talks before. 2 pounds. So yep, some of you nailed it right on the head. These bats, while they are large with wingspans, huge wingspan, they actually don't weigh that much because a lot of that size is these wings, which are really, really thin material and they don't weigh very much. So big bats only weigh 2 pounds, and these ones only eat fruit, so they're not like in the movies where they're gonna, terrorize people. Bats don't do that. These are just fruit bats. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the world's smallest bat, the bumblebee bat, which weighs less than something. So this object is something in your everyday life that you might have in your bag or your purse. Oh, y'all, I feel like y'all have seen this before. A quarter, a gram, a penny, quarter, 10 grams, dime. Okay, you ready? A penny. Yep, so the very, very, very small bat, less than the size of your thumb tip, and weighs less than a penny. So we have big bats with 6-foot wingspans, tiny bats less than your thumb tip, and everything in between. So lots of diversity of sizes of bats. So bats are found on all continents except Antarctica. There are bats in places like Alaska where it's cold and you might not think there's bats. There's I believe 5 species of bats in Alaska. But yeah, they're really found all over the world except down here in Antarctica. And bats are found in many different environments. So when I think of bats, I tend to think of trees like forests and like rivers, like these really lush places. And that's true. There's a lot of bat species that live in forests, tropical rainforests. This is definitely good bat habitat. But there are also bats that live in much more open environments. So there's bats that live in places like deserts and prairies. They hunt out in these big open areas or fly over these areas to get to they commute over these areas. Like I said, there's even bats in cold places like Alaska, where we might not think that there's a lot of bats, but they can survive during the summer months and then hibernate in the winter. And there are bats in urban environments. So in cities and towns, in my backyard, I have bats flying around during the summer. Some bats are pretty well adapted to living in urban environments. You might even see bats flying around street lights, like outside your school, or under stadium lights when there's a football game happening. So yeah, bats really live all over the world in many different environments. Now, what about some of these bat myths or things that you hear about bats? Anyone want to put in the chat some things like sayings that you've heard about bats, or things that you hear about bats? Yep, blind as a bat, good one, blind as a bat. That is a very common one that I get a lot. The rabies, yep. Highest vector for rabies, vampires, yep. Yeah, you guys are hitting some of the most common ones. These are great. So yeah, can't see, yep, blind as a bat. That's my first one, that blind as a bat saying is not true. Bats are not blind. All bats have eyes and all bats can see perfectly well. You can see here, some bats have really tiny eyes. This is an insectivorous bat or an insect-eating bat that, flies around and hunts insects. So they have eyes, but they have ears that they usually use for echolocation to help them navigate and see even better at night, but they still can see. And then some bats, like fruit bats, have really big eyes because they don't echolocate. They just use their vision to see, and that's how they find their prey, which is fruit. So you have different bats with different sizes of eyes, but they all can see. They all see better than us at night. They have better night vision than us. And some bats can see in some color. So another one that I hear is this rodent thing, like bats are mice with wings or flying rats. That is not true. Bats are mammals. They are just like rodents. They have fur like us. They give birth to live young. They feed their babies milk just like mammals do. But they're also not birds. I hear this a lot, that because they can fly, they must be birds, but they're not. So they are mammals, and they are not rats with wings. They actually belong to their own order, evolutionary order of mammals called Chiroptera, which means hand wing. And you can see why they're called hand wing, because if we look at the wing of a bat here on the top and the wing, or sorry, that's not the wing, the arm of a human, we can see they have the same bones as we do. There's the upper arm here, the upper arm bones, the lower arm bones here. And then the really cool part is they have these 5 fingers, just like we do, a thumb, just like we do, and then a first finger, middle finger, ring finger, and pinky. Look how long these fingers are. If we had fingers the size that bats have, our fingers would be like 2 to 3 feet long. That's huge. But they use those fingers with the membrane, the wing stretched between them, to be able to fly. So they're actually more closely, I don't know all the updated genetics evolutionarily, but more closely related to primates genetically than evolutionarily than to rodents. I need to check all that. If anyone knows more, I'd love to hear it in the chat. Oh, another one of my favorite bat facts is the longest lived mammal of its size. So this is the Brandt's myotis, and it has the world's longest lifespan for a mammal of its size. It's about, that big, the size of your palm. And this is a big difference between bats and rodents, in that rodents usually live very short lives, 2 to 3 years, maybe a little bit longer. How long do you think this bat lived in the wild, or is still living? We don't know. So we have some guesses: 44 years, 25 to 30, 30, 60, 24. Yep, good guesses. I love all the guesses. Ooh, 120. I want to live to be 120. 41. Yeah, you guys are doing great. 41 years. You got it, Virginia. 41 years was this little bat. It was at least 41 years old. Some researchers caught it and banded it, and then let it go. And then 41 years later, another group of researchers caught it. And because it had that identification band on its wing, they could identify it as the same one as before. So it was at least 41 years old, which is amazing given how small these animals are, how high their metabolisms are. Usually high metabolism in an animal means short lifespan. Bats usually defy that. A lot of bats we have here in the United States are living 10, 20, maybe 30 years as like a normal lifespan. So there's actually a lot of research, scientific research, going into how can we create some sort of gene therapies or some sort of medications, treatments to help us live to be, 300 years old and healthy. So bats might be the fountain of youth that we've been searching for all these years. Now, another difference that I like to highlight between bats and rodents is their reproduction. So rodents that are, similar size, again, not related, but similar sized bodies, have multiple litters per year. Each litter can have, 10 or more babies in it. So they have like hundreds of babies in their lifetime. Bats only give birth to 1 baby per year. Typically 1. There are some species like this eastern red bat that's common in the eastern United States that often gives birth to twins or triplets. But for the most part, bats around the world are reproducing 1 baby per year. So that's very slow reproduction. So that means if something happens to a bat colony, like something disturbs it, or something happens and the population is diminished, that colony is going to take a long time to rebound its numbers. So that's a very, very important thing for conservation to keep in mind. Now, bats have many different diets. With over 1,400 species around the world, they eat lots of different things. So most bats around the world, about 70% of bats eat insect, or they're insectivorous bats. They're eating things like this one here has a moth. Moths are very commonly eaten because they're very juicy. They have a lot of good food in them. Same thing with beetles, like this one has a cockroach, and then beetles are a big source of food for a lot of these bats that eat insects. Things like katydids, scorpions, there's lots of different insects and arthropods that bats eat, including some mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are not the main part of bats' diet for the most part, but these bats are eating some of these insects or these mosquitoes that are, in our yards. Now, this is kind of based on lab work, so we don't know how commonly this happens, but some bats have been found to eat up to about half their body weight in insects in a night. I just like to show this because the fact that they can do this is amazing. Because if we had to eat enough quarter-pounder hamburgers in one night to be like a bat, how many hamburgers would you have to eat? So I'm not going to make you do the math, but get your number in your mind about how many quarter-pounder hamburgers you would have to eat. Okay, of course, depending on your weight, if you're a kid or an adult, 300 plus hamburgers in one night that you would have to eat to be like a bat. Like I said, we don't know how often they do this out in the wild, but the fact that they can eat this much is mind-blowing. It's because they have very high metabolisms, they're flying around, they really need a lot of energy to help sustain them. So just, next time you're at McDonald's or somewhere eating a hamburger, think about, oh my gosh, could I eat 300 of these and be like that? I sure could not, that's for sure. Now, how do bats find insects at night? We talked about that bats all can see and all have eyes, but when it's pitch black outside, like there's no moon out, you're in a big forest and it's really dark, how can bats see to find their prey? They do use their eyes, but like I mentioned, many bat species also use echolocation or sonar to help them find insects. So echolocation is just like what we think with sonar. The bats emit like a yell usually out of their mouth or nose. That yell, the yellow, will go out into the environment and then it bounces off an object like an insect. And then that echo, the purple lines, go back into the bat's ears, and then they can actually tune in to where that insect is, and that's how they can hunt insects, even in pitch blackness without being able to use their eyes. So echolocation is a huge adaptation for these insect-eating bats. Now, another adaptation that helps these insectivorous bats find and hunt insects are huge ears. Not all insectivorous bats have huge ears, but some of them do. And I love these pictures because look at these ears. This is the spotted bat that's found in the western part of the United States and up into Canada. They kind of look like a cow. They have black and white spots. So they're like a black and white cow. But they have the largest ears of any bat in the world. It would be like if our ears were about 3 feet long or so. That is a huge ear. And these bats use these ears to hunt insects flying around, but also some of these insectivorous bats pounce on insects and arthropods that are on the ground. For example, scorpions and centipedes. They're crawling on the ground, and these bats with huge ears use those huge ears to hear that thing crawling around, and they can then pounce on it on the ground and eat it. And some of these bats, like the pallid bat, not on here, but the pallid bat that eats scorpions is immune to the scorpion sting, so they don't die or get sick from being stung. So pretty cool, just the crazy ears. And I want to show this one here in the bottom right. These are its ears here, so very big. And you cannot see its eyes, but it does have little eyes that are kind of buried in the fur, but it does have eyes. So what about fruit? There are some bats around the world that eat fruit. They're called fruit bats. I love this picture. This bat has a nice juicy fruit, and it's going to shove that fruit into its mouth and squeeze and drink the juice. Sometimes they'll eat the pulp too, and then they spit out the rest of the fruit. And what's in the rest of the fruit that we usually spit out? Like when you eat an apple, what part do you spit out if you get in your mouth? Well, yep, seeds. Don't eat that. Yep, seeds. Same thing with bats. They usually spit out those seeds, or if they ingest those seeds, they'll eventually poop them out. And those seeds will grow into new plants. So these fruit-eating bats are helping replant and regrow places like tropical rainforests where, we're clearing, cutting down trees, and these bats help replant those plants. And sometimes these bats are called the gardeners of the forest because they're literally planting these fruit trees and plants and helping them regrow. So bats are great gardeners of the forest. Now, what adaptations or things do these fruit-eating bats have to help them find their prey or their fruit? So these bats, like I mentioned before, often have very large eyes and large noses because they use those large eyes to see the fruit on the trees, and they use those large noses to smell the fruit. So they don't need to use echolocation. So these bats don't use echolocation. They're just using their eyes and their noses. And of course they have ears too, to hear. Ooh, carnivorous bats. These are some of my favorite types of bats. There are bats that eat other animals. So this poor little frog's about to get eaten. But yeah, some bats eat frogs. Some bats eat birds. You can see this bird here. They're hunted at night while they're migrating or roosting. So some bats eat birds. And some bats, like this ghost bat in Australia, eat other mammals like rodents, like this one has a mouse. And some of these carnivorous bats can actually eat other smaller bat species. So pretty cool. And surprisingly, some bats, like this bulldog bat, can even eat fish. And they actually go fishing. So you can see this picture here, this bat is skimming over the surface of a pond where there's little tiny like minnow fish that kind of rest at the surface of the water. And it skims the surface and grabs the fish with its large back feet and claws. Can you see how gigantic its back feet are and the claws? They use those feet to scoop up the fish into its mouth, and then they go fly and hang while they eat the fish. So the fact that some bats can actually go fishing is pretty darn cool. Now, remember the myths about all bats being vampires. There are 3 species of vampire bats that do eat blood from things like mammals, things like cows and pigs, and also birds, things like chicken and wild birds. But remember, there are over 1,400 species of bats around the world. Only 3 of those species eat blood. Only 3 are vampire bats. So they're all found in Mexico and Central and South America. We don't have vampire bats here in the United States. And they do eat blood, but they're really cool bats. I've actually gotten to catch and hold vampire bats in the wild, of course, with proper training and permits. But these vampire bats are one of the only bat species that can run on the ground. They can actually run. So if you remember after you get off of here, if you go to YouTube or just Google vampire bat on treadmill, you will see video clips of vampire bats like being studied, and they're running on these little treadmills. So definitely take a look at that. That's pretty cool. And they're very social. Vampire bats live in colonies, and they're very, very social bats. They have very tight friend groups and family groups. They will actually help feed their friend in the colony. If their friend doesn't get a blood meal that night, this sounds gross, but the bat will regurgitate some blood for its friend. It's helping feed its friend when it doesn't get food. So yeah, vampire bats are very, very cool. Now, some bats particularly the ones I work with here at BCI, eat nectar from flowers. So you can see that bat was like flying onto an agave plant, and they lap up, you can see they lap up the nectar from the flowers. So these are eating nectar just like hummingbirds do, just like bees and butterflies and moths. Bats are very important pollinators. In fact, bats eat over 100 species of bats eat nectar. So about 8% of bat species eat nectar around the world. And they're pollinating over 300 plant species or types of plants around the world, including one of my favorite breakfast snacks, bananas. Wild bananas are pollinated by bats. There's a lot of bat pollinated plants, agave plants, which we use to make tequila and mezcal for all you adults out there. So yeah, bat pollination is very important for over 300 plants worldwide. Now, how do bats reach deep in the flowers to get nectar? Well, like I showed before, they have long tongues to reach inside those flowers. I love this picture because can you see this is a tube that's a clear tube, but that's filled with nectar. What's this pink thing coming out of this bat's mouth? All the way from its mouth, all the way down to about here. What is that? That pink thing. Anyone put in the chat? I mean, you know what it is. It's tongue, exactly. Look how long that tongue is. Some of these bats have tongues that are 1.5 times their body length. That would be like if I stood up, if we stood up and put our hand in the air, our tongue would go from our fingertip all the way to the ground. That's kind of nuts. And I get people ask me all the time, like, how do the bats fly around with such a long tongue? They actually have a special kind of cavity in their chest where the tongue kind of coils up when it's not in use. So that tongue is not just flopping around outside its mouth while it's flying. It actually retracts into its kind of chest cavity. So, but yeah, very, very, very cool. And like I said, this you can see zoomed in here. They shove that tongue deep into flowers to get the nectar. And I love bringing this up about bats versus hummingbirds and who is the better pollinator, because I think we all know about hummingbirds being pollinators, insects being pollinators, but not as many people are aware of bat pollination. So if we look at a hummingbird and we look at a bat and look at the yellow stuff on its head, what is the yellow stuff that's covering their heads from the plant? Don't eat the pollen. You're quick on the computer. Pollen, exactly. So all that yellow stuff is pollen from the flower. And if you look here, the hummingbird has pollen on it. It's got some. But how much does the bat have on it? Like a ton. Bats tend to get much more covered in pollen. In fact, in some plants, hummingbirds are called nectar robbers because they're so good at hovering that they actually don't get super covered in pollen. Versus, remember that video I showed you earlier of the bat kind of throwing itself onto the flowers? Bats get covered in pollen. And so if we think about who's the better pollinator in a lot of cases, bats are the winner. And that's because, like I said, they get more covered in pollen, so they spread more pollen than typically birds or insects do. And these pollinating bats tend to fly much farther distances in a night to go feed on plants than hummingbirds or insects. Some of these bat species can fly 30 miles, even more, actually, we're finding now, 30 miles one way from their roost at night to go feed and then come back to their roost in the morning or throughout the night. So these bats are covering a lot of ground. They're really great pollinators. So they're very, very important to have around. Now, what about threats to bats? As a bat conservationist, we work around the world to protect bats and to help save them from extinction. And what are the things that we're trying to fight against? So unfortunately, a lot of bats are under threat for a lot of different reasons around the world. Loss of habitat and fragmentation of habitat is one of the biggest threats to bats worldwide. So, if we think about habitat loss in terms of us cutting down trees to build new houses or, clearing areas for agriculture, all of that can disturb where the bats are living and make them homeless, essentially. So loss of habitat is a big thing. And for bats that are eating nectar from flowers, they need certain plants. So if we start cutting down those plants, they're not going to have food. Disturbance by people and vandalism can be a threat in some areas. You have like this cave here that people go in and have parties in the cave, or they'll like put a fire in the cave, because I saw someone put ignorance. Robin put ignorance in the chat. People sometimes are afraid of bats, and so they'll go and like dynamite a cave because they're afraid of the bats that are living there. That can be a threat. Direct hunting sometimes, for food can be a threat. This can be done at varying levels of sustainability, but when it's done in a way that you're killing, thousands of bats, that's when it becomes a problem. And then pesticides. We spray pesticides, insecticides on our crops a lot of times. And there's research into how those pesticides that the bats can ingest when they eat insects can affect the bats themselves. So there's a lot of work going into how that affects bats. And then Olivia in her introductory video mentioned white nose syndrome, which is a really big problem here in the United States and in North America. This number is actually old now. This fungus has killed over 6 million bats in the United States, and that's an old number. Basically, this fungus grows on the bat's noses, its ears, its wings, basically its skin membranes during hibernation in the winter when the bats are basically sleeping. And it kind of acts like, I like to think of it as like poison ivy. It kind of starts irritating the skin. The bat wakes up from hibernation. Its metabolism is like super revved up now that it's awake. And so the bat's hungry. And so the bat has to fly out of the cave looking for insects to eat. And because it's the dead of winter in like, New York, where it's, feet of snow, there's no insects to eat. So these bats are either starving to death or freezing to death in the cold. So yeah, this is a big problem that, BCI has a lot of research trying to figure out how to stop the spread of the fungus, as well as how to treat the bats that have it and help them survive. So a lot of work going into this. Now, I always like to end on a positive note because, bat conservation can be sad sometimes, but there's a lot of hope out there. And we need more people to get involved in bat conservation to really help these animals. So what can you do? What can we all do to help bats? One of the things I really want to do in my yard this spring is plant a bat garden. So if you live somewhere like in the Southwest United States or Mexico that has these plants that are pollinated by bats, for example, agave plants, like in Mexico or the Southwest, you can plant these agaves, these cacti, the big columnar cacti, and these bats can feed directly on these plants. So you're providing food for them in your garden. But what if you live outside of an area that has pollinating bats? Like I live in Colorado, we only have insect-eating bats. So what about the rest of us? Well, you can plant night blooming flowers that open at night, which then attract nocturnal insects like moths that our insectivorous bats can eat. So by planting night blooming flowers in your garden, you can attract these insects and provide a buffet for the insectivorous bats to eat. And you'll have your own little food chain in your garden and help support these bats. So again, if you have native night blooming flowers, they tend to be like these lighter colored, like pale yellow or purples, white flowers that are open at night. Fruit trees tend to be pretty good. And of course, if you can, try not to use pesticides in your garden if you can, because again, that can help support the bats if you don't use pesticides. And I know this is a long link here, but if you go to Bat Conservation International's website and you Google gardening for bats and Bat Conservation International, we actually have a guide to gardening for bats. And we're starting to develop native plant lists for different regions of at least the United States right now. So yeah, check back for more information, but we do have a guide to help get you started. With these bat gardens, if you are able to provide a water source, like a pond or a large pool of water, that's great because a lot of bat species actually drink directly from ponds. You can see this little bat has its mouth open, and they'll like skim the surface of the water to get water to drink. So bird baths, unfortunately, like small bird baths are not big enough. It has to be 10, I think 10 to 12 feet is like usually the length for them to be able to swoop. But yeah, if you have a pond, that is fantastic to help provide water for these bats. Now, what about where bats live? What can you do to provide roosting sites for bats to live in? If you have these kind of dead trees or snags that are in your yard, if they're not posing a threat of like falling over onto your house or anything like that, leave them up, leave them standing, because you'll get these big holes that bats can go into and roost in at night and during the day. A lot of these old snags have like bark that's kind of peeling away from the trunk, and the bats will roost under the peeling bark. Or they have these cracks and crevices that have might not seem like a good spot, but a lot of bats do like crevices. So if you can, leave those dead standing snags standing. Alternatively, if you have bats, for example, in your house that you want to get rid of out of your house, and you're going to do an exclusion, and those bats are going to be homeless, one thing you can do is think about providing an alternative roost site for those bats. And one way to do that is to put up bat houses. Bat houses are kind of hit or miss. They're not always the solution, but in those cases where you have bats that are being excluded from somewhere, they can be a great use. And there's different types of bat houses. There's kind of the standard flat ones that you see. This is ones that I built in Georgia and Athens. There's this rocket box design that's like, looks kind of like a rocket. And then of course the bat condos. This is if you have like thousands of bats. There's ones in Florida that have 40,000 bats that are pretty cool. Someday I'd love to get a bat condo if I live in a place like that. But yeah, these bat houses can attract bats to live, especially if you're removing them from somewhere else. And I like this little picture of these little evening bats from Texas. These are some videos and pictures I took during my undergraduate research in Texas in bat houses that I built. So I was very excited. And if you're going to do bat houses, if you're able, I love this idea of a roost community, where if you can, putting up multiple different types of bat houses, or painting them different colors, putting them in slightly different locations, can help create different microclimates, or can help create different temperatures in one house. One might be hotter, one might be colder. And that gives the bats choices to move around between houses. So I always like to think if you have the space and the ability to put up multiple bat houses, that is ideal. And again, BCI, we have information if you go to our website. We have the Bat House Builder's Handbook that should be up there, and then also just tips for how to install bat houses, and have some plans like DIY building your own bat house. So check that out. And then the last thing is follow bat organizations like BCI. We are on Twitter/X now, and Instagram. We're on TikTok. I forgot to include that on here. But yeah, learn more about bats. There's lots of other bat organizations too out there. So the more you learn, the more we can share with others. And that is one thing I would like you all to do today, is after you leave here, think of one. If you want to do more, that's great. But at least one thing that you learned today that really like wowed you, and go tell that to your parents or your guardians, your friends. Go tell that to somebody, because the more we share about bats, the more people will realize how cool they are and how important they are, and that we really do need to protect them. And it makes bat conservation so much easier when we have people like you all who love bats and are interested in bats. So that's all my presentation. I do want to thank Olivia for making this happen. Thank you so much for bringing this to the school, and internationally too, I hear. And for Mr. Barrett, I hear that you were very instrumental in making this all happen and helping your class make bat houses and learn about bats. So I wish I had teachers like you when I was in school learning about bats. So thank you for all the work you've done. So I think we have time for questions. I will stop sharing my screen and we can go to question time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen. Okay,
Yeah.
so we've got plenty of questions. You can type them in the Q&A box. That's the best place for me to see them. If you're not on Zoom, you can type them in whatever comment box you're in. It's YouTube, Twitch, what have you. We also have a bunch of questions that were collected by Olivia and her adults. So we'll start with one of those. So let's see. So from Chloe at Doral Academy in Reno, Nevada. She wants to know if bats only hear through echolocation or can they still hear with their ears?
Good question. So they can do both. So the echolocation, they hear it through their ears, but they can also hear regular sounds. So like they could hear us if they were, in a room with us. And bats talk to each other. A lot of bat species are very social. So they will have calls that are not echolocation calls. They'll have social calls, like kind of like squeaking, and they'll like bicker and they're calling kind of like, brothers and sisters, squabble. So yeah, they communicate and they can hear each other also with their ears. Good question.
Cool. Let's see. Adrian is asking, is it known why red bats have twins triplets compared to other bats?
I don't know why that is. I would be curious if any of our BCI staff know that. I do not know. But yeah, for some reason they tend to have like those twins triplets, whereas most other bats just have single babies. Good question. I'll have to look that up.
Let's see. And let's see. From a college student at the University of Illinois, Lola asks if pesticides harm bats, especially the runoff that goes into streams where they drink.
Yeah. So I haven't kept up with all of that, the newer research, but some of the things that in Australia, for example, those pesticides can be, ingested by the bats and can affect, for example, sperm count of the males, so the reproductive health of the male bats. And then for the females, it's been shown that they can actually feed those pesticide residues through the milk to their babies, which again, we don't know the full long-term impacts of that. But yeah, it's very concerning. And also, like you said, through water, yes, bats drink. So I would not be surprised if there's a lot of stuff happening through water sources. But yeah, that's something I need to look up more on the current research on all that. Yeah.
Got it. Question from LinkedIn. Has there been a paper or a study on key species as seed/pollination distribution in increasing fauna?
And can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, so has there been a paper or a study on key species as, like, I assume key species of bats, as seed or pollination distribution in increasing fauna? Increasing
the what, sorry?
Increasing the number of fauna.
Yeah, so I think more it's the studies that I've seen have focused more on the plant side. So in terms of pollination, in terms of genetic diversity of the plants themselves. And yes, there's been a lot of studies on how bat pollination helps increase seed production of a lot of these plants and can help, again, with that genetic diversity of the plants themselves. I'm not sure about the animals, but yeah, definitely for plants, they have a big impact.
Let's see. From Bella in Luitpold Gymnasium in Wasserburg, Germany. Bella wants to know if planting native plants in general helps bats by giving them a greater variety of nectar, insects, etc.
Yeah, so yes, in the blanket answer, yes, native plants are fantastic to support diversity of insects that are out there that the bats can eat. when we see a lot of these areas that have like invasive plant species, and there's like one species of plant instead of 10 different natives, we tend to see less insect diversity in those areas, which again can affect the bats. Different insectivorous bats eat different insects too. So some of the bigger bat species might eat the bigger beetles or the bigger moths. Some of the smaller little insectivorous bats will eat, gnats or smaller insects. So having more diverse insects can better support bats. So yeah, we definitely encourage native plants wherever possible.
Got it. Okay. And Candy has a question. I think going back to when you were explaining how, big-eyed bats is usually fruit, little-eyed bats is usually bugs.
Yeah.
Does the shape of their noses have any significance?
Ooh, yes. So yes, shape of the noses. There are some of the bats that are called leaf-nosed bats, and their little noses kind of stick out like this and look like a leaf. And they actually help direct the echolocation from their noses, and can help with that echolocation, for example. And yeah, the different noses again help with that funneling of the sound. So there's huge like diversity of nose shapes of bats. Yeah, definitely pretty cool. And then some, like the big noses for the fruit bats, they use those to smell, like very good sense of smell. So those are different shaped.
Got it. Okay. And now we've got a question from Mr. Barrett's class. They want to ask what causes the fungus that strikes bats while they sleep.
Yeah, so that white nose fungus, white nose syndrome, it's unfortunately an invasive fungus that was brought over to the United States. So unfortunately, it's not native here, and that's why it's so bad, because it basically invaded here. And it's spread on like clothing, like when people go into caves, it can spread through people's clothes. Bats spread it around to each other into different caves. But yeah, it just grows, and it's a cold-loving fungus, so it grows really well in those colder caves where these bats are hibernating. So unfortunately, it's like a perfect storm.
Got it. Is there any chance that humans will overconsume agave? Like, or is there enough out there in the world?
Yeah, good question. So yes, there is a chance. Yes, that does happen in some areas with harvest of agave plants for things like tequila, mezcal, the uses of agaves. Yeah, we do see unsustainable use in some areas where the people are basically harvesting all of the plants before they flower, so before they're able to provide nectar for the bats, and that's where we're seeing problems with the bats. So yeah, that's why the Agave Restoration Initiative at BCI, we're working with partners across the US and Mexico to replant agaves to help support sustainable use. It's a very broad initiative, but yeah, we want to make sure that there's enough agave plants that are connected across the migratory corridor of these bats, because the three species of pollinating bats that rely on agave plants, at least to some extent, migrate over 700 miles every year between Mexico and the US. So they really need good, healthy agave populations across that entire corridor. So yeah, there's a lot of work going on in both the Mexico and the US for that.
All right. A question from Cormel from Oratorio Don Bosco Misión in Santiago del Estero, Argentina. Carmel would like to know, how is climate change impacting bats?
Ooh, that's a big one. So, well, off the bat, the nectar feeding bats, like the ones that feed on agaves, we're seeing different timing of blooming of the plants that those bats are eating from. So with climate change, we're seeing a lot of times these plants blooming earlier in the seasons, sometimes when these bats haven't quite yet migrated to the area yet. And so there's a lot of fear of like mismatch of the bats' timing of migration and the plants flowering, because if they don't line up, the bats won't have food when they arrive in an area. So that's one thing. We're seeing or expected to see range shifts in both the bats and some of these food plants to new areas where they haven't necessarily been before. Contractions, like some of these plants are, like the agaves, are expected to go higher elevations. And that the lower elevation areas are going to be, with climate change, will be too hot and too dry for a lot of these plants to survive. So the higher elevation areas will stay cooler and be those like climate refugia. So yeah, there's a lot of that happening. Climate change in general, with increasing heat, like extreme weather events we're seeing. I don't know if any of you saw in the news in Texas over the past couple years, we've had flooding, we've had extreme heat events, also like in Australia, like bats just dropping from their colonies and dying of like heat stroke because it's getting so hot for so long. Water availability, with increased climate change, you have more drought, less water for the bats to drink. Again, lots of threats. So all of the things that we're doing, bat conservationists do, is trying to think, with climate change, what can we do to help make sure those bats are protected into the future, not just what we do now. So yeah, good question.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question from Girl Scout Troop 6195 in Illinois. Zoe wants to know, how did white nose syndrome spread so quickly?
Unfortunately, people brought it, like I said, on clothes, like cavers or researchers. We don't know who, of course, brought it, but to New York State. And then from there, I think people spread it before we knew what was happening. People spread it to other caves, like through caving, for example. And then also the bats themselves. They have the fungus on them. Before hibernation, they're flying around to different caves. They're interacting with other individuals and can spread it from bat to bat. So it was both bat spread and people spread, unfortunately.
Got it. And then one last question. I saw it from a few people, most recently from Chumi. How is light pollution affecting bats? Is it things as little as a street light, or is it like big cities?
Good question. So kind of both. So I will say light pollution at night can be a problem for some bats, and it can benefit other bats. Well, kind of benefit. Some bat species, like I mentioned, actually will fly around streetlights, for example, because there's a lot of insects that are attracted to those streetlights. So those bats will chow down on the insects around those streetlights. So in that case, they might be getting more food, but they're also more visible to predators like owls that are hunting bats at night. So it's kind of like, is it good? Is it bad? And then we do know that there are, some bat species that just do not like light. They're very nervous around the light. They don't like flying around in bright areas. And so that really affects where they can eat, where they can travel. And so, yeah, it can be a problem. And I think it's both levels. So obviously cities are a big problem for like migration because they're just so bright as a whole. But then, individual streetlights can certainly cause problems like locally for local bats. Good question.
Well, thank you again, Kristen, for giving us a crash course in bats. Thank you to Olivia and all of the adults and other young people involved in the collaboration. Thank you as well to the audience for joining us. So to learn more about BCI's work, visit our website, batcon.org. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to our mailing list and newsletter. And that's where you'll hear about future webinars and the work that we do. This webinar recording is available on our YouTube channel. You just search @ bat conservation on YouTube. Kristen, any final words for us?
One thing, I love all the comments in the chat. So thank you all so much for coming. And remember, go tell at least one cool fact that you learned today to someone outside of who's here. So that's the one task I will leave you with. Thank you all for coming. We need more bat conservationists. We need bat advocates. So thank you all. And thank you, Olivia, again, for being our bat champion and setting this up. Y'all are great.
Absolutely. So that's all for now, everybody. I hope you all love bats more than you did an hour ago. And we'll see you at the next Bat Chat. Bye.